Hello, my name is Jonathan Dickstein. I am assistant professor of Jain and Vegan Studies at Arihanta Institute and also a visiting affiliate professor at Claremont School of Theology. Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. I host a lot of the episodes that deal with our vegan studies initiative. A lot of the episodes that we have are audio only, but once in a while, I host these special live versions, which are really exciting. We get to do video versions that will be available later as a recording, but also they're live in the sense that we dedicate time at the end of the discussion between myself and my guest to open it up for some Q&A from the audience. And as I'll remind you at a few times, you will be able to drop those questions in the Q&A box and I will convey them to our guest. And as for our guest, Victoria Moran, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. And while we'll spend a lot of time, I mean, a lot of this episode, Vegan Then and Now, with Victoria, about kind of her path and her history in veganism. I do want to at least highlight that Victoria is an acclaimed and well-renowned speaker and author and has made appearances on so many news outlets like for decades. And so it's very much a privilege for me to have someone with such a wealth of experience, both thinking and writing about these issues, but also in the public eye. And I say that because Victoria has been vegetarian since the 60s, I believe was vegan in the 1980s. And and wrote a book right on veganism in the 80s as well. So who's even thinking about, not to mention writing about veganism in 1985 when I believe that book came out. So without further ado, again, I want to welcome you for being here. Thank you for giving your time.
Oh, it's an honor and a privilege. I love what you do at the Arihanta Institute, just because Jainism, which was something that I had not heard of Jainism until I became vegan and learned that it was, the Ahimsa faith. There are several Ahimsa faiths, but Jainism really seems to have it down. And so to know that there is this wonderful institute that is spreading these ideas far and wide is very special.
Great. So I'm going to ask you the question that I ask everyone who at least I interview. Uh,
Okay.
and that question is, I think a lot of podcasts that talk about vegetarianism and veganism, they ask for kind of the vegan story. When did you become vegan? Or when did you become vegetarian? And while I'm interested in that, I think what interests me more for my guests is asking them, how and when did you first get radicalized for animals? And what I mean by that is how and when did you first realize that we as a society regard and treat animals in a fundamentally uh, problematic, if not simply unjust way?
I think long before I became vegetarian, because even as a child, and I was fortunate that because both my parents worked in the days before daycare, and I had this nanny who was really quite spectacular. She told me about vegetarians when I was 5, even though she wasn't one herself. But we rescued animals and tried to anyway. And so I really think I grew up with the idea that we're not seeing things correctly in this way when it really became something that I felt that I needed to get out and make noise about. I was probably 21. I had left my hometown of Kansas City and was working for about a year and a half in the Chicago area at the Theosophical Society in America. And it's quite vegetarian, lacto-ovo vegetarian. And I recall that the cooks were these lovely Mormon women who thought that we were so deprived that they put extra butter in everything, just so that, we wouldn't get skinny and weak. But when I left there, I had learned about the American Vegan Society Jay Dinshaw, the late founder
Mm,
of the American Vegan Society, had come to the Theosophical Society to speak there. And even though it was going to take me a long time to be full-time vegan and not fall off the wagon, I was dealing with a binge eating disorder. Plus, it was just weird at that time. We're talking the early 1970s to be vegetarian, much less vegan. But I knew in my heart this was the thing. And I was very involved in the animal movement even before I had my last lapse back to
mm,
lacto-vegetarianism. So I started doing street activism, we would call it now. In 1971, we had something in Kansas City called the American Royal, which was a livestock and horse show. It happened
mm,
every year. I believe it still happens, but has moved to Indianapolis. And I got together a group of people to picket this annual livestock and horse show. We did that in 1971, 72, and 73. And I learned only in the past couple of years when I was just playing online and Googled my maiden name that those protests were picked up by the wire services. So I knew
oh.
that the Kansas City Star wrote about them, but it was so unusual then for anybody to be picketing anything that had to do with farm animals that it was in the Boston Globe and the LA Times. So that's the date I'll give, 1971, October.
That's interesting. And if we could just linger on that for a moment, because I appreciate what you said is that there's how would I say this kind of ways in which activism, vegetarianism, veganism kind of like all hover in different ways, even now, but especially around that time. And like, right, you might be somebody who goes and is at the stock show being active, but might not even be vegetarian, right? Or vegan. And then you have some people who might be vegan, but aren't going to be out on the streets doing any kind of activism. So I think it's kind of really interesting. And I think this was been a conversation in recent years about how there are a lot of people who are engaged in animal activism that at least not then or not yet or whatever aren't, how do we say, following certain practices that seem to be kind of the like entry standard in today's movement. But I guess back then, did it just seem more kind of, how would I say, diverse and just accepting a kind of like come one, come all if you want to come and
Well,
be
not
active?
exactly. I mean, we had the animal welfare organizations, and then we didn't expect people to necessarily all be vegetarian because things were focused a lot on companion animals and also single issue campaigns like horse-drawn carriages or the wearing of fur. But I think anybody that was going to protest a livestock show was going to be at least vegetarian. Now,
Hmm.
vegan was extremely odd. In fact, you mentioned my 1985 book, Compassion, the Ultimate Ethic, which grew from a fellowship in religious studies that I was getting in the early 1980s. So I did my research in 1980 in London on that book. And I was vegan to the degree that I was able to be vegan, meaning that I would be vegan until I had an eating binge or something else happened. I would fall off the wagon, back to dairy, but then I'd get back on. And so even when I was writing that book, it was getting off, getting on. But by the time it was actually published by a publisher in 1985, I was fully vegan, and I'm happy about that because I don't think you know that it's good to be writing books about things and putting yourself out for something that is so difficult that you yourself can't do it. It would be like if I were to write a book now and say that you should get up at 4 a.m. and meditate for 3 hours and do all these things that I don't do. It might be a nice idea, but it's not my book.
No, I think that's true. I think there's also sometimes maybe a space in between, right? Because uh, this isn't what I want to focus on now, but also like, maybe you are someone who 80% of the time gets up at 4 a.m. in the morning and meditates for 3 hours, but 20% of the time struggles with it and doesn't do it. I still kind of want to hear that story. You know what I mean? Even if maybe they're not, um, what do I say, perfecting this
Yeah.
kind of aspiration. I kind of want to hear that story too, right? Because that's an interesting story. But
Well,
but
I
let's,
think
oh, go ahead.
everybody says, "Oh, I wish I'd gone vegan sooner." Well, we all wish we'd gone vegan sooner. We could have saved more animals. And yet, for those of us who didn't do it overnight, the people who have trouble, the people who kind of go back and forth. I was talking with Dr. Neil Barnard of Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine and lamenting vegan recidivism. And he said, you know that the statistics for people who stop smoking cigarettes is that they try 9 times.
Mhm.
And I like that
Yeah.
because if it takes somebody 9 tries to wind up fully vegan forever, that's good.
Yeah, not to mention the people who are smoking and quitting smoking. There's even a social stigma against smoking, and they still, right? And they still kind of uh, go back to it. And when we're
Right.
talking about veganism, there is no social stigma.
Oh,
Actually, if
I think there
anything, no,
is.
no, no. I mean, it's the opposite stigma. That's what I'm saying. Is that to be non-vegan is encouraged.
I see.
And what
You're
I'm
right.
saying is
You're
to be
right.
a non-smoker is encouraged,
That's
but
right.
to
That's
smoke
right.
isn't. I'm saying despite the stigma,
Yeah.
they go back to it 9 times.
Right.
Imagine what it's like if we lived in a society that promoted smoking,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
think that's kind of more where we're at.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's funny. It depends on what subculture you're in, what
Hmm.
is celebrated and what isn't. So I think on any of these moral decisions, it really has to be very personal, regardless of where I am. If in certain settings, the bar is, well, the good people are the vegans who completely avoid honey or this kind of thing. But in other settings, it's like being vegan is weird. So if you're committed, you're going to be committed in both settings and
Yeah.
all the others.
So let's take a step back because now we're kind of talking about things that are happening much more, or happening now. So
Yes.
what I'm really curious about, and that's why I really, when we started talking about this podcast, was
Yes.
what I was most interested in is I think a lot of people are somewhat unaware of what the cultural landscape was like in the 1960s, in the 1970s. And we can go beyond that, 80s and 90s and so on. I tell people that, I didn't meet a vegetarian until almost 2000. In college, I had never met a vegetarian prior to that. So could you just speak about what it was like and what it felt like early on?
Sure. So I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, which is known for steak and barbecue. We used to have the largest stockyards, second to Chicago,
Mm.
when stockyards were in large cities. Now they hide them. And yet, I heard about vegetarians when I was 5 years old from my nanny because she was in Unity. So, Unity is a progressive Christian movement that was founded in the 1890s by very committed vegetarians, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. They were so vegetarian. Now, we didn't have vegans then, nobody was using that word, and people were pretty much giving eggs and dairy a pass, but they printed their Bibles on faux leather in the 1890s.
Oh,
Who
wow.
knew such a thing
Mm.
existed? So I knew about vegetarians even as a child, even though they weren't around me, but I knew that some really excellent people were superior and they did this kind of thing. So it was in the 60s, the idea was that hippies were vegetarian. Now, that was not true. Hippies were not fond of having jobs. So they tended to eat a lot of brown rice and granola because that kind of stuff was cheap. But generally speaking, if you took a hippie out for a steak, they would be very grateful. Now, this was not entirely true across the board. There was, for example, Stephen Gaskin, who was a religious guru out in San Francisco, and he had a following of people. And his teaching was that religion needs to make sense in the here and now, and you shouldn't be hurting anybody. So they were vegan and they actually became the farm. They moved
Mm.
from San Francisco to Summertown, Tennessee, and set up this commune. And they were known for so many things, one being the very first vegan ice cream, Ice Bean. They also started, and it's still going, the book publishing company. So a lot of particularly vegan cookbooks that a lot of people love, like Eat Vegan on
Hmm.
$4 a day and the Ayurvedic Vegan Kitchen and many, many others come from there. And they also did midwifery. And they were very well known for the fact that they were not fans of terminating pregnancies. And so they put out the word that if you are a woman and you're pregnant, don't get an abortion. Come
Yeah.
here. We will take care of you. You'll get excellent midwifery services, all kinds of care. And then if you don't want the baby, we will adopt the baby.
Oh, wow.
So that kind of thing was going on, and I knew about that as well. And so when I went vegetarian, which was 1968, I stopped land animals. 1969, I made it to vegetarian. Um, I hadn't even heard of veganism. I
Mm.
think I was living in London in 1968 and went to fashion school. And so it was very easy there to go vegetarian because there were lots of vegetarian restaurants, a lot of history. I mean, the UK, because they first were trading with India and then colonized India, there was this exchange of ideas going back and forth for almost 400 years. So many of the ideas that originated in India or that were popularized there, reincarnation, vegetarianism, had made it to the UK. So there were a lot of vegetarians there. Now, when I lived there in 1968, the Vegan Society had been established. The Vegan Society was founded in 1945.
Hmm.
Donald Watson, the prior year, had come up with the term vegan, and they thought of themselves as non-dairy vegetarians. Those early vegans were all part of the Vegetarian Society, which had been founded in, I believe, 1825, a long time ago. Um, so when I heard about veganism and the American Vegan Society, that was profound for me because this was 1970 and the the whole kind of, anti-war movement and the flower power and all that had been around for a couple of years. So there was definitely a counterculture. There were people speaking out for the rights of all kinds of minorities. And it it resonated, even though in a practical way it seemed way too difficult for me to manage consistently, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Now, they had founded Jay Dinshaw and then his wife
Hmm.
Freya, who had been his pen pal. She came over from the UK to meet him and she stayed and they got married. So he founded the American Vegan Society in 1960. And I always say to people, what you need to understand about 1960 is it was still the 50s. In fact, it was the 50s at least until 1964 when
Hmm.
the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. That was really when the 60s started. So the idea that this man would have the idea that the US needed a vegan society when Eisenhower was president, when things were just very much everybody was in lockstep, and other than the beatniks and we had Allen Ginsberg writing poems and Jack Kerouac, but this was very much edgy people that Jay thought we needed a vegan society was so far sighted. And then in the early 70s, the International Vegetarian Union had proffered the US a world vegetarian Congress, but they wouldn't do it in this country because we didn't have a national vegetarian society. We hadn't had one of those since the 1800s. So Jay at the Vegan Society let a couple of his interns go off into the world and start the North American Vegetarian Society so that the US could host the International Vegetarian Union Congress in 1975. And that was absolutely stunning. And I think really put the modern vegetarian slash vegan movement on the map.
Wow, that's such a fascinating story. Thank you so much, and some of those details, and I think really um, expressing just how much it's kind of minority movement trying to find its way, right, in a world that's just kind of really not ready for it.
Yeah,
Um, and some very inspirational figures that we still talk about today. So
there
that's
were for sure.
wonderful.
And what's interesting too is that there was no animal rights movement. We have to
Mhm.
remember that before 1975, when Peter Singer wrote Animal Liberation and coined the term animal rights was not a concept. Now, there were a lot of us who were interested in animals and we did animal welfare things. And I think we had animal rights beliefs. We just didn't call it that. So this is before PETA. This is before anything that we think of as the modern animal rights movement. So there were some people in New York City, Cleveland Amory, Henry Spira, who were doing a lot with animal welfare. Some of them were vegetarian, some of them were not, but they were involved in the media. So they were getting the idea of animals. Why are we still wearing furs? Why are there carriage horses on the streets of New York City? And of course, there still are. That's one of the ones that's such an ongoing fight. But the vegetarian vegan world was just making its little bit of progress. Not so many people yet in this country, but it was establishing itself, I think, even earlier than what we would think of as animal rights. So at the conference, the World Congress in 1975, some of the people that were there who were absolutely inspiring and instrumental in this movement, the most famous person was Dick Gregory.
Mhm.
Now, Dick Gregory was a comedian and he was very popular in the 1960s. We always said he was a big comedian because he was popular, but he was also very large. He was over 300 pounds. And there was a lovely naturopathic doctor, Alvinia Fulton, who had a little health food store on the south side of Chicago. And she was literally waiting for Dick Gregory to walk by one day. And she was going to just lure him in and change his life, which is exactly what happened. So she explained to him what he needed to do to get healthy, which was to stop eating all animal products, eat a lot of raw food, drink juices, and she also introduced him to ethical vegetarianism. Now, because he was a Gandhian, because he was a student of Dr. King, and Dr. King was a student of Gandhi, as was Jay Dinshaw with the Vegan Society, there was this idea that ahimsa and reverence for life couldn't be put in a little mold of, well, we're going to be nice to people of our community, of our race, of our religion. We've got to spread that out there where it's all beings, all living beings. Dick Gregory said, and I might not be quoting him exactly right, but he said, Dr. King taught us about nonviolence, and I've gone on to see that it's also about violence to the mother cow and her
Mhm.
calf. So Dick Gregory was there. There was also a fascinating couple, Helen and Scott Nearing. Now, they had written a best-selling book called Living the Good Life about homesteading in Maine and in Vermont. Now, Scott Nearing had been banished from the U.S. around the time of World War I because of his opposition to child labor. The idea that child labor was to oppose that with something radical is just so hard for those of us now to get our minds around. But he did that. He was very left wing. And actually, at some point, a member of the Communist Party, I believe, and there was a movie called Reds. It's a fabulous classic movie with Warren Beatty, a really good movie, and it was about the communists, I believe, in the U.S. around that World War I kind of time. And something interesting in that movie that I don't know if it's ever been done in another feature film is periodically they would stop the action of the story and they would have a little gathering of very elderly people who had been part of that left wing world back in the 19 teens. And Scott Nearing was one of those. So that's just a couple of examples of people who were really making a difference. And then somebody younger, a couple, I'll tell you about a couple of younger people who were there who were really making a difference. One was Nathaniel Altman, and Nathaniel Altman wrote a book called Eating for Life. It was published 1 month before Diet for a Small Planet, which was a huge, huge book. But
Mhm.
Nathaniel's book was actually the first book on vegetarianism to be published in the US in the 20th century. And I feel very close to that book because Nathaniel was working at the Theosophical Society, as was I at that time. And he had a manual typewriter. But in my office in the library, I had an electric typewriter. So he would bring down each chapter and I would type it. And as I typed, I was thinking, I think I could write a book. And now, 14 books later, that's kind of fun. And then the other young person that I want to mention who was there in 1975 was a very, very quiet young man. And his name was Paul Obis. He was a registered nurse in Chicago, and he had started a magazine called Vegetarian Times. So he was typing it, mimeographing it, and taking it around on his bicycle to health food stores in Oak Park, Illinois, one of the western suburbs of Chicago where he lived, and Chicago as well. And he asked at that time if I would write for him. And he said we pay 50 cents a word, which just sounded grand. And so I started writing for Vegetarian Times and did that for just about 20 years, a little bit over 20 years, quite regularly. But that magazine went on to become the biggest vegetarian publication, predating Veg News by some 30 years or so. And, it's gone now because things come and then they go. But that conference started a lot and it brought vegetarianism and ultimately veganism out of a dark closet and into the limelight.
Wow, that's really great. And some of these figures, yes, and texts like Die for a Small Planet and Dick Gregory, Nathaniel Altman, I'm less familiar with, but I just shared, I see you did an interview with Nathaniel, right, some years ago.
Yes.
So hopefully people can dial into that. Yeah, and I'm not to be too crass. I remember hearing that famous, or at least now famous, what Dick Gregory quote that's like, I don't eat anything that farts, farts, doo-doos, peas, or screws. And
Sounds,
but
I'd never heard that one before, but it sounds just like him.
I
And
mean, but
and he
sometimes it's that simple, right? Sometimes it really is that simple. As someone who works in academia, I can get very heady and technical, but sometimes you read something by by Dick Gregory, and you're like, oh, well, that's just as accurate.
Yes.
Uh,
Well, he wrote a book called Dick Gregory's Natural Diet for Folks Who Eat. And there was a joke in the title because he didn't eat for long periods of time. I remember, I think I was maybe still in high school, maybe not, but turning on the Johnny Carson show, and there was Dick Gregory saying that he would not eat solid food until the Vietnam War ended. Well,
hmm.
my whole life, the idea that it would ever end seemed kind of impossible. And I thought, my goodness, this man is going to die. But
Hmm.
Dr. Fulton knew how to put herbs and powders and things in the juice.
Oh, I think
A lot of
oh, there,
whey.
you're back. You're
Oh, did
back.
I leave?
Yeah, I had to pause. It's okay. You're back. You're good.
Okay. Um, and every time he'd be on TV, he'd be smaller, but he had these fabulous custom-made suits, and he always looked really good. But I remember that my first joy when the Vietnam War was over is thank God this horrible war is over. And my second thought was, and Dick Gregory can have some food.
All right, so I think like I want to, there's at least two questions more I want to get. And the first is, um, I think even nowadays when people look at vegetarianism and veganism, it's so, besides the fact that it's often racialized, and that's kind of a bigger conversation, but the kind of gendered components of not just eating, say, plant-based foods, but also how compassion itself towards animals or a desire to kind of fight for their liberation or the kind of motivation to do so is often chalked up to very much a kind of sentimentality, which, and I say that word specifically because sentimentalism is typically gender coded as being something that's very feminine. And the code with that with all the would be like weak, right? It's that there's all these tender-hearted, hysterical women, right? The trope of the hysterical woman, the sentimental woman who is kind of overreacting. And I just say that as kind of a general um, preface to I'm curious if that's present now. We see that even present now in discussions. What was it like for you early on, being in a smaller minority of, say, animal activists or vegans and vegetarians, and also having to do so as a woman?
Then, as now, there were more women in the movement than men. And then, and not so much now, the men tended to be in charge of things. That
Surprise,
is
surprise.
changing. I The only thing that I really noticed in that context was that if you were a vegan woman willing to do food demos, you never did anything else. And
Mm.
so I knew that I wanted to get out there. I wanted to talk about ideas. And so I never got into being very good with food because that was just the way it was. But otherwise, I never thought much about gender in terms of the animal rights movement because in when we look at animal abuse, farmed animal abuse in particular, both genders are so exploited for their sexuality. I mean, we
Hmm.
have the killing of the baby boy chickens and the impregnation of the mother cow and separation from the baby and all these awful things. And so to me, if one values humans in having choice and freedom in their gender expression and their sexuality, we really need to extend that to animals.
Yes, I mean, I think this is obviously a key point is that typically when we think about these, or as Carol Adams used to say, these feminized protein industries, such as the egg and dairy industries, in a sense, right, it makes sense. The kind of direct, the individual who's directly extracted from is typically a kind of female sexed organism, but there's so much exploitation that's happening, right, to make that happen. Obviously, in the dairy industry, when it comes to kind of this kind of coerced ejaculation from male bovines, but then also, right, this massive death of male chicks in the egg industry. So it's very interesting how these are often, right, elided and it's hard not to think that they are often omitted because it would make a lot of men who eat meat or eat animal products feel uncomfortable that this is kind of part and parcel of the industry, right? I think the kind of male bravado or classical male bravado is fine with the killing, it's fine with the killing, right? This is what strong, non-sentimental people do. They accept killing and they engage in the killing of animals. But when we start talking about the sexual violence that takes place and the reproductive violence takes place, I think it's much harder for individuals to kind of reconcile that. But on the other side, it's interesting what you say that you didn't, I guess you said a little bit, right? If you were a woman who started to engage in cooking, then you were someone who was just the kind of cook vegan. And that's what you would be booked as. And I really appreciate what you said is that like, you never really got good at cooking because people do expect that if you're vegan, somehow you know a lot about food. Like you know a lot about food and you're really interested in food. And maybe that's for some individuals who, right, get there through meticulously looking at their health and their nutrients, and that's how they got there. But at least in my experience in the last couple of decades, most people I know don't know too much about food. And if they know about food, it's not because they're vegan. Um,
Well, that's a very interesting point, and it is a difference even today between the US and many other parts of the world, the UK, Israel, Germany, other places where veganism is growing at a steady clip. There, it is an ethical position. Environmentalism is probably just behind that, and then health is in there somewhere. In this country, if you say you're vegan, you're going to probably get a response like, my sister's gluten-free, or, I used to be vegan, but then I felt weak and now I'm carnivore and, the world is beautiful. And I've been around it long enough to know that this is an acultural choice, and it's very difficult for most people to maintain any kind of choice that the people in their communities are not supporting or allowing with some enthusiasm.
mhm.
And over time, people often give up on it. So I think it's really important for us as vegans to see ourselves as living in line with the highest light we have. That comes from Peace Pilgrim, who was a wonderful vegan activist from that era too. She walked around fasting until given food, being outside until given shelter, and talking about how we won't have world peace until we get inner peace. But she was profoundly vegetarian, a vegan whenever possible because she was taking food from other people. But anyway, she talked about living up to the highest light we have. And I believe that that's the most important thing we can do because for most people, for some reason, the idea of living without animal products is is profoundly impossible. Unlike living without sugar, and we love sugar. I mean, I think if you said to most regular people, what would you rather have, a hamburger or a giant hot fudge sundae on soft serve? I think you're going to get way more sundae people.
Hmm.
And yet, when push comes to shove, if somebody had to make a conviction, no animal products or no sugar, they'd tough it out with the sugar because there's just something visceral and and evolutionary, perhaps, about our reliance on animal products. And so I think that for us as vegans to really make a difference, we need to be in touch with the highest and best that's in us. We need to eat well and unfortunately be as healthy as we can. There's no guarantees that anybody is going to be healthy forever, regardless of their diet. And yet people are looking to us. So, we want to kind of be on a little bit of the straight and narrow, perhaps that way, just knowing that people are looking at us and and then just shining our light. I did a blog post not long ago that called 13 million points of light. because one study suggested that there are 13 million vegans in America. I never know if these polls are correct or not. But, if we can do that, I think we can go far towards opening other people's hearts and minds because you just never know what's going to reach somebody.
I think that brings me to maybe one more question, and then if folks who are here want to ask questions, they can. I mean, I clearly could ask more questions. So many things I'm curious about, but it seems to me that in your writings and kind of over the maybe it's gradually over the years, but it seems to be a theme is connecting veganism as you understand it to spirituality. Right. And this is not kind of for everyone. I mean, I would even say for myself, I at Arihanta Institute, I work in Jain studies and animal studies, and there's so many shared values I have with the Jain tradition, especially kind of in these fundamental perspectives and ethics. But with respect to spirituality, I might kind of be, how would I say, less eloquent to describe the connection, but it seems to be so central in your work and your thinking. So could you just talk about that a little more? Was it something that was always there? Has it developed over time? And how do you understand that bridge?
It's always been there. When I first heard about vegetarians, and it was described to me really in a religious context, Dee Dee was telling me that people in Unity that are really serious about it don't eat meat. Now, that was the case then, not so much the case now, although there are some wonderful people in Unity, like Reverend Carol Saunders, who are really pushing for this. Um, but when I finally took the plunge to vegetarianism, it was because of yoga. I read 3 books about yoga when I was 17, and they all said that if you're going to be serious, you have to stop eating animals. And that resonated with me because I loved animals. I had tried to be vegetarian at 13. I lasted 3.5 months. And one night my mom made pot roast, and that was the end of that experiment. But I dropped out of biology class, even though I was told that that was college prep and I would never go to college. And I had these awful visions that I would have this terrible, impoverished life because of that. But it's like I can't cut up those animals. And so like for a lot of people, it came in small parts. I remember when I left biology class, the teacher said, but you eat meat, don't you? And I said, oh, I do now, but I won't always. And he said, you know what? I believe you, and gave me my little pass to get out of biology. So the spiritual part has always been there for me. I think that some of the images, Jesus holding the lamb. I mean, it was Jesus holding a lamb, not slitting the throat of the lamb. And I've always been fascinated by the big picture, why we're here, and all of that. So for me, living kindly and honoring the divine in all creatures, I just had to come to that. Nothing else would have made sense. And I know as we're kind of winding down here, because you said this was your last question, I do want to let people know if they are interested in the history of the movement in America, that there is a 3.5 hour docu-series, brand new, from Farm Animal Rights Movement. And that's an organization that's been around since the early 70s. It used to be Farm Animal Reform
Mhm.
Movement. And if you go to 5decades.org, you can learn about the docuseries. I was part of that. Jim Mason, Martin Rowe, Mary Finelli of Fish Feel, of course, Alex Hershaft of Farm, and some other people who really go back because, and Freya Dinshaw from the American Vegan Society and Peter Singer, of course, since he wrote Animal Liberation and that got animal rights going. I think you might enjoy that if you like the history of this thing.
No, I definitely think so many people will enjoy that. I will myself. I've heard about the series. I haven't watched it yet, but I think it's really critical. I know that Roger Yates is also someone else who's very insistent upon sharing the history of the movement and really understanding kind of where it came from, different viewpoints, different hurdles, different approaches. Because right, shifting a little bit even from say the personal adoption of veganism to a kind of cultural shift, we still haven't really figured it out, right? This seems to be which tactics or what'll be the kind of a tipping point. Certainly, there is progress, but kind of understanding our past can only help design a better future.
Well, there's tremendous progress if you start back far enough. We're obviously in a dip right now. I think we peaked in 2019, year of the vegan. And the problem with being popular and trending is that you can't trend forever. And
Hmm.
then somebody else is going to be popular. And because we're in a society that loves extremes, it's going to go not from veganism to maybe vegetarian or something. It's going to go all the way to carnivore. So I think we're just called upon now to stick to our guns and be the kind of vegan that that you want people to think about this movement. I always think of when my cat died 8 or 10 years ago, and I was waiting for the subway and I was crying. And this lovely woman sat down and asked what was wrong. I told her my cat died. And she was so nice. And she told me about a cat that she had had. And the subway came, I got on it, and I looked out the window, and there she was standing with her Jehovah's Witness friends passing out Jehovah's Witness literature. Now, a lot of people don't have anything good to say about the Jehovah's Witnesses. I have not studied that denomination. I don't know if it's good or bad or a cult or what it is. I just know that the only one I have ever met was just as nice as she could be. She didn't try to convert me. She didn't do anything except try to help me feel better since I'd lost my cat. And that's the kind of vegan I want to be. And I think some people might be inspired to convert, and at least others will have a positive feeling about us. And so if their child decides to go vegan or something happens, they'll just be a little more open.
And I think that's inspirational. This is for a much longer, conversation, I think, and I talk about this a lot, is um, the resistance um, that we see both on the individual level and the societal level, and what that says about our fundamental relationship with animals. And also, I think it really is true that most people deep down understand that there's fundamentally something wrong with how we just immediately comport ourselves, orient ourselves towards animals. And right, as with most things, right? If we admit that, what does that mean? What does that say about us individually, in our families, in our community, and as a society? But you know what? We reach these same watershed moments in human justice issues as well, right? But this one is just so deeply entrenched. So I think
And
lastly, if you, well, I mean, you can speak to that, but lastly, I just do want to make sure you have a few minutes to share with everyone, if they want to find you and find your work, where would you direct them? Because you have so much work over so many years. So it's kind of like if someone's like, yeah, but I want to know what Victoria is thinking about now. I want to see where, I can kind of find what's filtered through after all these years and where she is and what she's thinking about. So definitely that. But if there is something from years ago that you also think people could really learn from, please share that as well.
okay. Well, mainstreetvegan.com is where I have been hanging out for a very long time. I wrote the book Main Street Vegan. It was published in 2012. And if there's time for a little story, I do believe that we are in the age of the vegan miracle, for lack of a better phrase. I think that it's just time for the animals to get their due. And I think sometimes remarkable things happen for those of us who are trying to bring this about. So I was working on the book Main Street Vegan, and when we got a publisher, a Penguin Random House, I talked to my editor the first time. She said, "Oh, we're so happy to have you, so happy to have the book. We hate Main Street. You have to call it something else." So walking up Broadway, my husband and I ran into someone so famous you can recognize him from the back, and that was Michael Moore,
Mm.
filmmaker. And after I gave my card to the woman who was with him because he'd liked one of my earlier books and wrote about it in Oprah's magazine. So he came up Broadway saying, "We need to talk, we need to talk." Anyway, in one of these subsequent talks, because we did start talking after that about food, um, I mentioned I'm supposed this book is supposed to be called Main Street Vegan. The publisher hates it. And he said, "She's wrong. Let me talk to her." So there was a three-way call between my editor, an Academy Award winner, and me. And he convinced her, she convinced the higher ups. And once I knew that Main Street Vegan was going to be the book, all these other things started to pop. There ought to be a Main Street Vegan podcast, which there has been and continues to be for the past 13 years. There ought to be Main Street Vegan Productions. And we were lead producer for the 2019 documentary, A Prayer for Compassion, about food choices and spirituality. And we are now working on a feature film, Miss Liberty, created by my husband, Reverend William Melton. And I'm the co-writer. And trying to produce a feature film is probably the most difficult thing on earth. I mean, I haven't tried to climb Mount Everest blindfolded. That might be equal, but it's tough. But anyway, that's what's going on the production side. And then Main Street Vegan Academy. We've been training vegan lifestyle coaches and educators every year since 2012. It's live on Zoom, and this year we're going to be having a New York City experience optionally for people who want to come and do some in-person as well as the Zoom course. So all that is at mainstreetvegan.com. Um, I do have an author website, victoriamoran.com, which is just about books. We did that because my most recent book, Age Like a Yogi, is in this platform where I don't have a platform. I've been doing yoga since 1968, but I don't do it on Instagram. So we came up with the author website if you're into books and want to see that. And otherwise, I'm just around and about on social media. Instagram is Victoria Moran Author. YouTube is Victoria Moran Vegan. And it would be lovely to know that we're connected.
Well, thank you so much. This has really been a pleasure. And honestly, if we had 3 hours, I would just like ask so many little details because I think, um, so much of like the warmth and the intrigue in these stories are these like little moments, like that situation you just described with Michael Moore. And I'm sure you have some from the 80s and 90s as well. But that's all we can do for today. I do want to tell our audience that this recording will be available both as a video and audio at the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. And I really encourage everyone to just stay tuned. Not just for the podcasts that I host about our vegan studies initiative and kind of veganism adjacent related issues, but also all of the other podcasts we really do with some wonderful guests from academics to scientists to activists to authors, filmmakers, and so on. So I really encourage everyone to stay attuned to those offerings. And lastly, most importantly, I just really want to say thank you so much, Victoria, for being here. I think you really are such an inspiration for people who are in whatever the vegan movement is or whatever the animal movement is, who think they've been in it a long time and they've been in it for 5 years or 10 years, but you really have this broad vision and a kind of tenderness, patience, but also resolve that I think is really helpful for anyone getting involved at the current time. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, that you're very kind to have me, and thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all so much. And we will see you next time on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. Bye.